An arrogant millionaire humiliated his maid in front of everyone, laughing at her and her son's simplicity. But that very night, this same boy stood up and, with a single sentence, silenced the entire mansion. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel now to help us bring you more impactful stories like this. Victor Langford's mansion, perched on one of Boston's highest points, looked more like a palace than a private residence. The imposing white marble columns reflected the golden light of the crystal chandeliers, which hung from the ceiling with calculated extravagance, casting a shimmering glow throughout the room, where every detail had been carefully crafted to exude wealth and power. The polished Italian marble floor reflected the silhouettes of the guests, while tables draped with impeccable linens held exotic floral arrangements and sparkling crystal glasses awaiting the evening's toast. Outside, luxury cars formed an impeccable line, driven by uniformed chauffeurs who waited patiently in the cool of the evening. The garden, illuminated by discreet lights, resembled a living painting with its classical sculptures and fountains gushing water in harmony with the ambient music. Everything had been planned to impress the invited foreign investors, men and women who had come from different continents to discuss contracts that could redefine the future of the Langford Empire. Victor not only wanted to show off the grandeur of his fortune, he also wanted to assert his place as an unattainable man who dominated not only the market but also the appearances that sustained his impeccable image before the world. Victor Langford, at 49, was the living portrait of arrogance built over years of ruthless conquests and calculated choices. Tall, with carefully slicked back hair, his face etched with lines of determination and coldness, he wore a tailored suit that seemed molded to his body like a prestigious armor. His blue eyes carried the icy glint of someone who saw everything as numbers, contracts, and advantages, incapable of dwelling on anything that didn't bring him profit or power. To him, people were pieces on a board, moved at will, useful as long as they served his interests, and disposable when they no longer represented value. He walked among the guests with a smile that seemed more like a rehearsed gesture, distributing calculated greetings and empty words that hit a mind already focused on the next negotiation. His presence was magnetic, not because he inspired confidence, but because he exuded the authority of someone who knew no one in that room would dare challenge him. Victor was proud not only of his fortune, but of the fear and reverence he inspired, as if every look of respect were further proof of his superiority. That night, more than signing a billion-dollar contract, Victor wanted to imprint his mark on the memory of every investor present. The main hall had been transformed into a stage of ostentation. Waiters glided silently, serving rare French champagnes, while orchestra musicians performed classical pieces in a strategically lit corner. The international elite gathered there, commented in different languages on the future of Langford innovations, each word charged with expectation, and Victor observed everything like a general surveying the battlefield before a crushing victory. For him, nothing could go wrong, and any sign of weakness was out of the question. His speech would be the culmination of years of effort, a spectacle designed to reinforce his image as an absolute leader. However, hidden beneath all that perfection, there was a silent, almost imperceptible tension that hung in the air like an omen. It was as if the night itself, despite its glittering splendor, held a twist that no one dared predict. And that would begin right there, at the heart of what Victor believed he had complete control over. The elite gathered that night seemed to have stepped into a hall of power, silently dictating the course of the world, with pens and signatures more lethal than any weapon. There were cold-faced Swiss bankers, precise-spoken German industrialists, Italian politicians masking their vested interests behind broad smiles, and American executives whose suits carried the weight of conglomerates that influenced the global economy. All wore haute couture, sported expensive watches that sparkled under the lights, and held crystal glasses reflecting the golden glow of French champagne. The conversations, though laced with elegant laughter, revolved around colossal numbers, mergers, acquisitions, and market strategies. Every glance exchanged was more than a greeting. It was a calculation, a silent reading of who was winning and who was losing on that invisible chessboard. The feeling was that, in that room, there was no room for weakness, only for displays of power. Victor moved among them like an arrogant maestro conducting his own symphony of wealth and influence. His presence was a mixture of imposing and intimidating, reinforced by carefully chosen words that always placed him a step above the others. He spoke of his latest projects with the confidence of someone who already considered them a success, even before any real results, and each sentence was accompanied by calculated gestures that conveyed absolute dominance. When the foreign investors mentioned doubts or difficulties, Victor laughed condescendingly, as if the solution were all too obvious for someone of his stature. With each new arrogant joke, some guests chuckled out of courtesy, while others glanced discreetly at each other, uncomfortable with such self-sufficiency. Still, no one dared to confront him. That night, he seemed untouchable, a figure above good and evil, sustained by the aura of invincibility his wealth conferred upon him. Yet, behind the glitter of the chandeliers and the classical music filling the air, there was an almost palpable tension. It was as if the event's grandeur had been built on shaky ground, ready to reveal cracks at any moment. The investors, though fascinated by the ostentation, were attentive to every detail, knowing that the slightest slip-up could alter the fate of millions. Victor himself, in his arrogance, seemed unaware that the same audience that applauded his strength today would be the first to turn their backs at any sign of weakness. It was the elite's cruel game, respect only as long as results were achieved. And, unbeknownst to him, he was about to jeopardize this entire image of perfection in a moment that would transform that night of triumph into an unexpected spectacle forever etched in the memory of all those present. As the glitter of the guests competed with the splendor of the crystal chandeliers, a discreet figure crossed the room with silent steps. Angela Carter, 34, a black woman, in an impeccable blue uniform, with yellow gloves that betrayed her invisible role in the evening's operations. She carried a silver tray with the dexterity of someone who has learned to be invisible amidst luxury, balancing full glasses without ever betraying the weight of the daily grind that consumed her. Angela's eyes, despite her fatigue, reflected dignity and a quiet strength that no insult could destroy. She knew she was in a territory where she was not welcome beyond the limits of her duties, and each movement was measured so as not to draw unnecessary attention. Yet, that night, there was something different in her expression. She was not alone. Beside her, walking with timid steps and dressed too simply for the setting, was her son Caleb, just 14, trying to shrink from the luxury that seemed to overwhelm him. Caleb wore a worn white shirt and dark pants that contrasted sharply with the impeccable suits and gleaming dresses around him. His curious gaze roamed the room as if to absorb every detail, yet at the same time, he possessed the caution of someone who knew that a single misstep could result in humiliation. To many, he was simply the maid's son, an intruder tolerated out of necessity, as Angela had no one to leave him with that night of work. He, however, carried a silent presence that went unnoticed by most, but which would soon become the center of attention. Caleb observed the guests, the rehearsed speeches, the forced laughter, and a part of him already sensed that there was something fragile behind all that glitter. It was as if his simplicity enabled him to see cracks that eyes accustomed to luxury would never notice. Angela, aware of the risks, kept her son close, as if the proximity were a form of protection. With each step, her heart beat faster, fearing that Victor or one of the guests would notice the boy's unwanted presence and turn the moment into a source of embarrassment. However, Caleb seemed more attentive than anxious. His eyes fixed on the stage prepared for Victor, on the screens displaying complex graphics and the documents passing from hand to hand, as if everything contained some enigma to be deciphered. Angela, even without understanding, sensed something different in her son's gaze, a restrained gleam that she herself dared not decipher. What none of those present could have imagined was that this boy, invisible to the eyes of the elite, was about to write the most memorable scene of the night. And when that happened, not even Victor Langford, with all his arrogance, would be able to laugh for long. Victor Langford walked to the center of the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to applause in any setting. His tailored suit reflected the golden light of the chandeliers, and every calculated gesture conveyed the arrogance of a man who believed he held the world in his hands. When he stepped onto the small stage erected for the evening, the chatter of the guests immediately ceased, and an expectant silence fell over the room. He opened his arms as if embracing everyone's attention, smiling with that air of superiority that both irritated and fascinated. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his deep voice echoing with confidence. "Today we celebrate more than numbers. Today we celebrate a victory, the strengthening of alliances that transcend borders." His first sentences were rehearsed, precise, and drew approving glances from the foreign investors, who smiled politely, awaiting his next words. On the table before Victor lay an imposing contract, its pages carefully organized and bearing official seals symbolizing the grandeur of the negotiation. He raised it theatrically, as if holding a trophy, and began reading aloud. But suddenly, upon reaching a passage written in Italian, his eyes narrowed. The confidence in his expression wavered for a moment, almost imperceptible, but enough for some more attentive observers to notice. The word was simple to some, but not to him. Victor blinked, coughed discreetly, tried to continue, but his tongue caught mid-sentence. The sequence of foreign sounds seemed to escape his control, and the silence that formed soon weighed heavily. The guests began exchanging discreet glances. Some frowned, others hid their laughter with sips of champagne. The millionaire, who always mocked others, was now on the verge of becoming the target of his own arrogance. The tension grew almost palpably. Victor, already sweating beneath his starched collar, struggled to improvise, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if each Italian syllable turned into an insurmountable wall before his eyes. He tried to laugh at himself, but the laughter sounded nervous, false, only deepening the awkwardness. Some foreign guests whispered among themselves, confused by the sudden pause, while others, understanding the scene, reveled in the arrogant host's momentary downfall. The room, previously filled with festive sounds, was now plunged into an almost cruel silence, where even the clink of a glass seemed too loud. And it was at that moment, amidst that power vacuum and the growing discomfort, that the eyes of Caleb, the maid's son, shone with an unexpected fire. For him, that obstacle was not insurmountable. It was just a rare chance to show the world that even the invisible could carry answers that the great ones didn't have the courage to admit. An awkward silence hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and each second felt like an eternity. The foreign guests, who had previously maintained cordial expressions, began exchanging discreet glances, revealing a mixture of surprise and discomfort. Some quickly consulted the contract in their hands, as if to confirm whether something so complex was really involved or if the difficulty lay solely with Victor. An Italian investor crossed his arms, arching his eyebrows suspiciously, while a Frenchman bit his lower lip, clearly trying to contain his laughter. There were also those who regarded the millionaire coldly, as if a single blunder were enough to question his entire credibility. The business climate, so carefully prepared by Victor, began to crack before everyone's eyes. In a corner of the room, a group of Asian executives exchanged hushed words, shaking their heads in disapproval. To them, who so valued discipline and precision, the mistake seemed a sign of unpreparedness. The glitter of the chandeliers and the luxurious setting were no longer able to hide the host's vulnerability. One of the younger guests even covered his mouth with his champagne flute, trying to stifle a laugh, but the gesture didn't go unnoticed. Others simply averted their eyes, as if unwilling to witness the embarrassment of someone so accustomed to stepping on others. It was an uncomfortable, almost cruel spectacle, because there was no music or movement to soften the judgmental silence. Every glance felt like a blade pointed at Victor. Victor, however, remained standing before the audience, feeling the crushing weight of those expressions. What should have been his greatest night of triumph was turning into a trap for his own arrogance. The guest's discomfort was merely the surface of something more dangerous: distrust. Investors accustomed to seeking security now saw a man incapable of carrying out even part of a contract without hesitation. And in that kind of environment, trust was the most valuable currency. One slip-up was enough for billions to be put in doubt. The air seemed thin, and with each passing second, Victor lost not only his voice but also his hold on his audience. Little did he know that, in that very room, someone invisible to the eyes of the wealthy held the key to reversing that disaster. But for that to happen, it would take courage to stand up at the most unlikely moment. Victor, realizing that the seconds of silence were turning into an abyss of awkwardness, lifted his chin and forced a booming laugh, as fake as the artificial glow of the chandeliers. Well, look at that. It seems my team of translators is on vacation," he said, his tone thick with sarcasm, shifting the weight of his personal failure onto those who depended on their salaries to survive. A few executives laughed, but it was nervous laughter, more for convenience than amusement. Victor's laugh, however, was cruel, and every word was intended to reaffirm his position of power. He glanced around the table of assistants, who shrugged, visibly uncomfortable. As if that weren't enough, Victor decided to go further, searching for a scapegoat to secure the sense of superiority that was slipping through his fingers. It was then that his eyes fell on Angela, who was discreetly moving around with a tray of glasses, trying to remain invisible as always. Victor narrowed his eyes, and, with that sneer only the arrogant can muster, shouted, "Maybe we should ask our maid to read this to us. Who knows, maybe she'll surprise us and show us she's good for more than just scrubbing floors." The comment echoed through the room like a slap. Some guests widened their eyes in shock, others laughed reflexively, oblivious to the implied cruelty. Angela froze in the middle of the room, her face burning with embarrassment, her hands trembling slightly as she still held the tray. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum, and for a moment she considered dropping everything and running away. But there was something more painful than the humiliation. The look on her son, Caleb, who was witnessing the scene just a few feet away. Caleb clenched his fists tightly, his eyes fixed on the father of the party, the man everyone feared and fawned over. Something burned inside him, a mixture of indignation and courage he had never felt so intensely. Victor's laughter still echoed through the room, but to Caleb it sounded distant, muffled, like the roar of an enemy preparing to be struck down. He saw his mother lowering her head, trying to compose herself, and in that instant he made a silent decision. He would not let this night end with another humiliation. The entire room might laugh, but he knew he carried something within himself that none of them imagined. Victor had chosen the wrong person to ridicule, and he would soon discover that, by mocking his mother, he had awakened a power that not even all his money could contain. Laughter still hung in the air when an unexpected sound cut through the suffocating silence. Caleb, his face partially illuminated by the golden glow of the chandelier, raised his hand timidly but firmly, as if carrying a weight greater than his own age could bear. His voice, though youthful, rang clear and resolute. "I can explain, sir." For a moment, the entire room seemed frozen, as if time had stopped before the audacity of a boy who until then had been nothing more than a shadow beside his mother. Eyes turned to him, some with astonishment, others with disdain, but all filled with curiosity. Victor, unable to believe what he had heard, widened his eyes and then let out a laugh that sounded like the crack of glass shattering into 1,000 pieces. The reaction was immediate. The guests, seeing an opportunity to join their host, burst into thunderous laughter that echoed off the mansion's marble walls. The sound of laughter mingled with the clinking of glasses and the murmur of conversations in different languages, creating a cruel cacophony that made Caleb's heart pound. Angela, paralyzed, felt the blood drain from her face. Her maternal instinct screamed to run to her son and drag him away, but something in his gaze stopped her. There was an unfamiliar firmness, a spark of courage that even she hadn't known the boy possessed. As the laughter grew, some foreign guests looked on in confusion, not understanding the language, but joined in the mocking tone just to keep up. The collective laughter turned into a shameful spectacle, fueled by the host's vanity. Victor, laughing loudly, leaned forward and, with a tone thick with irony, said, "Oh, that's too good. The maid's son wants to teach us a lesson." The sarcasm cut through the air like a blade, and the guests laughed even louder, as if they were in a theater and Caleb were just the clown of the evening. But while everyone laughed, the boy remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the millionaire, as if the mockery had no power to pierce him. Deep in his chest, Caleb felt a new strength, an unshakable certainty that his voice would not be drowned out by laughter. The collective laughter, which had previously seemed overwhelming, began to dissipate within him, transforming into fuel for something much greater. The room was still laughing, but the tension was about to shift, and in a few moments, those laughing would discover they had underestimated the wrong boy. Victor, realizing that the collective laughter was giving him back control of the situation, raised his hand like a conductor directing an orchestra and encouraged the guests to laugh even harder. The room transformed into a stage of mockery, where each burst of laughter seemed more deafening than the last. He slowly rose from his chair, walked a few steps toward the boy, and, with the arrogance of someone who believes himself untouchable, proclaimed loudly, "Let's all applaud this audacity. Just imagine, the son of a maid wanting to teach millionaires something." His exaggerated intonation drew even more laughter from those present. Some even clapped mockingly, as if witnessing a carefully rehearsed joke. Each word was a poison hurled not only at Caleb but also at Angela, who felt her heart shatter in silence. Angela, in her impeccable blue uniform and yellow gloves that now trembled discreetly, wanted to disappear. Every laugh that echoed off the mansion's golden walls sounded like a sentence of humiliation against her and her son. Her teary eyes roamed Caleb's face, fearing he would be crushed by the cruelty of the spectacle. But to her surprise, the boy remained steadfast. The simplicity of his clothes contrasted with the glitter of the jewels and expensive suits around them. But in that moment, there was something in his posture that made him greater than all of them combined. He didn't flinch, didn't lower his eyes, didn't let the weight of humiliation bend him. The 14-year-old seemed to carry within him an invisible strength, a glow of conviction that even some guests, amidst their laughter, began to notice uncomfortably. Victor, realizing that Caleb wasn't as shaken as he'd expected, intensified his mockery even further. "Do you know how to read, boy? Or do you just repeat what your mother says while scrubbing the floor of my house?" he snapped, eliciting more laughter, some even exaggerated, as if the guests were trying to please their host at any cost. The millionaire raised his champagne glass to the boy and concluded, "The truth is simple. A maid's son can't teach millionaires anything. That's the natural order of things." His voice echoed through the room, thick with contempt, as if he had sealed the boy's fate right then and there. But as the word spread, Caleb took a deep breath. His serene gaze and determined expression began to turn the laughter into silence. The boy was about to prove that it wasn't titles or money that define who has something to teach, and this revelation would fall like a thunderbolt upon everyone present. The room was still ablaze with laughter, but amid the deafening din, one detail began to disconcert some of the more attentive guests. Caleb never lowered his eyes. The boy in simple clothes stood firm, with the calm of someone with nothing to lose, yet with the conviction of someone harboring something greater than everyone else. His posture, unexpected for a boy of just 14, contrasted sharply with the host's arrogance. While Victor displayed his power through humiliation, Caleb displayed another kind of strength, the silent courage of one who refuses to be crushed. It was an eloquent silence that gradually began to unsettle even those who minutes before had been laughing mercilessly. Angela watched her son with unshed tears. She knew every detail of that look, so similar to Caleb's father, a simple man who had always taught her that dignity could neither be bought nor sold. The maid felt her heart race, torn between the fear that the boy would be further ridiculed and the pride that was beginning to swell in her chest. He didn't cower, didn't cry, didn't run into her arms as many expected. Instead, he seemed to grow in the face of humiliation, rising like an unexpected shadow amid the artificial glow of the crystal chandeliers. Caleb still hadn't spoken, but his silence already carried more weight than all of Victor Langford's speeches and jokes. One of the foreign investors, a gray-haired man with a serious expression, made an almost imperceptible gesture. He rested his chin on his hand and observed the boy with genuine curiosity. Another, a sharp-eyed businesswoman, stopped laughing and fixed her eyes on Caleb, as if beginning to sense there was more to him than the maid's son caricature Victor was trying to paint. It was as if, without saying a word, Caleb had cast a doubt in the air. What if, against all odds, he actually had something important to show? This subtle shift in the atmosphere did not go unnoticed. Victor, however, was unaware of what was about to happen. Caught up in his game of humiliation, he had no idea that the boy who dared to stare him down could, in an instant, turn the fate of that night of business and pride into a shock no one would forget. Victor Langford, still fueled by the collective laughter that echoed like music to his ego, raised his hand for silence. His narrowed, sarcastically charged eyes searched Caleb like a curious insect that dared to get too close. "Very well, since you insist so much," he said, his voice thick with irony and false cordiality. "The maid's son wants to teach us a lesson? Well, this is your moment to shine." The room erupted in renewed laughter, some so loud they blended with the notes of the orchestra playing discreetly in the background. Victor paused theatrically, walking a few steps across the room as if he were putting on a show, and pointed at the boy. "Explain, boy, explain in front of all these men and women who move billions, in front of diplomats, investors, and international leaders. Show us what your kitchen aisle wisdom has to teach us." The sarcasm was so thick it seemed to poison the air, but Caleb didn't back down. While many expected the boy to stutter, cry, or freeze in fear, he took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and stepped forward. There was no defiance in his gaze, nor arrogance, only a serenity that belied his age and his simple clothes. Angela, his mother, clutched the cloth she held in her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned white beneath her yellow gloves. She knew this moment could be devastating for her son, but she also sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that the room, though still filled with mockery, was beginning to quiet out of sheer curiosity, as if eager to witness the downfall of those who dared to challenge the impossible. Victor smiled, satisfied with the trap he had set. For him, there was no way out. If Caleb remained silent, he would be the butt of eternal ridicule. If he tried to explain and got it wrong, he would be irreversibly humiliated. "Come on, boy," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Show us that insolence is also hereditary." He crossed his arms, convinced he had yet another victory to collect in his cruel power play. What Victor didn't know was that, by giving him the floor, he had opened the door to the most surprising twist of the night. The laughter he had provoked would soon turn to disconcerting silence, and then to something even more difficult to bear, the respect that would involuntarily rise in the eyes of those watching. Caleb took another deep breath, and when he opened his mouth, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The silence that gripped the room was so dense it felt like it could be touched. Everyone was waiting for the boy's inevitable fall, but what they heard wasn't a stumble or a trembling voice. It was a firm, clear, and surprisingly precise explanation. Caleb fixed his eyes on the contract, which was still trembling slightly in Victor's hands, and in impeccable Italian, began to translate the phrase that had stumped the millionaire moments before. He not only translated it, but also explained its legal meaning, highlighting the difference in interpretation between the colloquial term and the technical term used in the document. His voice, though young, sounded confident, as if carrying the authority of someone who already knew the terrain better than anyone there imagined. At first, some guests chuckled, convinced it would be just another pathetic scene. But soon, this laughter turned to looks of surprise, and then to an almost reverent attention. Angela, standing in the back with the tray still in her hands, could hardly believe her eyes. Her son, who had so often been treated as invisible, was now standing before the world's elite, effortlessly translating a passage that had humiliated even seasoned lawyers. With each word Caleb uttered, she felt a mixture of fear and pride course through her, as if a new story were being written before her eyes. Some foreign diplomats, who had until then been embarrassed by the scene, began exchanging discreet glances of admiration. One even nodded in approval, impressed not only by the accurate translation but by the boy's ability to explain nuances that required intellectual maturity. The hall, accustomed to applauding rehearsed speeches, was now mesmerized by an unexpected voice. Victor, for his part, froze, his expression difficult to decipher. Outwardly, he maintained his arrogant smile, but his eyes betrayed a mixture of disbelief and irritation. He couldn't accept that the son of a maid, someone who, in his own words, shouldn't know much due to lack of education, was saving him from embarrassment in front of billionaire investors. He shifted uncomfortably, as if with every sentence Caleb spoke, he was being disarmed in front of everyone. He tried to interrupt, but was silenced by the attentive gazes of the audience, who no longer wanted to miss a single word the boy said. In the air, the laughter that had previously echoed had turned into anticipation, and everyone was beginning to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary. What had seemed like a joke was about to become an unforgettable twist. The transformation in the atmosphere was palpable. Just minutes before, the entire room had surrendered to collective mockery, laughing at the boy as if he were merely a distraction amidst the pomp of the evening. But now, every eye was on Caleb, and the expressions on the investors' faces had completely changed. Italian flowed naturally from his mouth, and with it came an explanation so clear and convincing that even the most skeptical foreigners nodded discreetly. What had been a source of jokes became a source of curiosity, then surprise, and finally respect. Angela, standing in the back, felt tears well up in her eyes as she realized that her son's invisibility had been broken, that he was finally demonstrating the value he had always held, but which the world insisted on ignoring. Victor, however, was unprepared for this invisible blow. He tried to maintain an air of superiority, letting out small, sarcastic chuckles and saying things like, "Just a coincidence," or "Anyone could do that with a little help from Google." But each time he opened his mouth, the audience's attention returned to Caleb, and the millionaire's discomfort became more evident. Sweat began to gather on his forehead, betraying his tension, and the knot in his tie seemed tighter than ever. It was as if he were trapped in a trap of his own making, ridiculing someone who had now proven, in front of everyone, to have undeniable talent. Victor's forced laughter sounded hollow, and the eyes around him no longer followed his mockery. Gradually, some investors exchanged serious glances, as if calculating the true weight of the scene. If a simple boy, the son of a maid, was capable of understanding the contract Victor couldn't read, what did that say about the host's leadership abilities? Doubt began to creep in silently, eroding the perfect image Victor had built over years of power and arrogance. And the more he tried to maintain control, the more it became clear he was losing control of the situation. The hall that should have been the stage for his consecration now became an invisible tribunal, and Caleb's words were the evidence weighing against him. In the air, there was a sense that something irreversible was happening, and Victor, for the first time in a long time, seemed cornered. When Caleb finished presenting his translation, the room seemed suspended in time. He had not only deciphered the Italian word that had left Victor paralyzed, but he had gone further. He connected the term to the legal context of the contract, revealing that, if interpreted as many there were misinterpreting, the billion-dollar deal could result in massive losses for foreign investors. The silence that followed was heavy, as if everyone was digesting the impact of the revelation. The boy, dressed simply and with a firm voice, had just saved a transaction that no lawyer present had bothered to thoroughly review. Victor's arrogance, until then, seemed to have built an unbreakable wall. But at that moment, that wall began to crumble before everyone's eyes, stone by stone, with Caleb's every word acting as a hammer blow to the tycoon's pride. The investors' gazes transformed into something Victor couldn't bear. Respect directed not at him, but at a boy who, minutes before, had been the target of laughter. One of the foreign guests, an elegant man in a gray suit, discreetly raised his glass to Caleb in recognition, and others soon followed suit. Victor felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the prestige he had so zealously cultivated was beginning to silently migrate to a boy not even old enough to drive. His forced smile disappeared, replaced by a hard, tense expression. Angela, watching from afar, felt a mixture of pride and fear. Pride in seeing her son prove his intelligence to the world, fear for what might happen now that he had exposed, in front of everyone, the fragility of the most powerful man in the room. The air was thick, and each breath seemed heavier than the last. Caleb, for his part, displayed neither triumph nor vanity. He simply concluded calmly, "That was what needed to be understood, sir. Now, the contract can proceed without risk to anyone." His words fell like a verdict, ending the tension that had gripped the room. What should have been a humiliation had turned into a silent triumph, and everyone there knew it. The boy not only demonstrated knowledge, but also character, because he hadn't merely translated. He had explained, constructed, and revealed the truth. It was impossible not to see the grandeur in that gesture. And, as Victor struggled to find something to rescue him from his shame, the audience's eyes made it clear that the brilliance of the evening no longer lay in the crystal chandeliers, but in the unexpected courage of a young man who dared to face the impossible. It was the definitive turning point, and the host, accustomed to commanding applause, now had to deal with the weight of a silence that did him no favors. The laughter, which seconds before had echoed loudly through the mansion's luxurious corridors, was cut off abruptly, as if someone had muted an entire orchestra. The silence that fell was so dense that even the crackling of the candles in the candelabras seemed louder than the guests' breathing. All eyes turned to Caleb, the boy in simple clothes, who stood erect with the calm of someone with nothing to prove, but who had just revealed everything. The contrast between his serene posture and the incredulity etched on the faces of the elite was a spectacle in itself. It was as if, in that moment, each person's role had been reversed. The millionaire, accustomed to dictating the rules, was cornered, and the maid's son, previously invisible, had become the absolute center of the narrative. At first, no one dared react, as if testing the reality of the scene. The foreign investors, until then restrained, began exchanging glances of admiration. One of them, a gray-haired man with a respectful expression, was the first to clap, discreetly but firmly, breaking the tension in the air. The sound echoed through the room like a call, and slowly, other investors followed suit, until an entire group openly recognized the boy's intelligence and courage. The applause was neither deafening nor forced. It was restrained, almost solemn, but charged with symbolic weight. Each clap was like a blow to Victor's pride, who felt his face flush and his heart race with the shame of seeing his authority eroded in front of everyone. Angela, clutching the tray tightly to contain the trembling of her hands, almost let out a tear, not of sadness, but of a pride that was growing faster than she could control. Victor, for his part, remained motionless, trying to compose himself, but he knew he was losing control of the narrative. What had once seemed like a simple business reception had transformed into a silent courtroom, where every glance and every applause judged his arrogance. He tried to smile, but the smile died on his lips, unable to face the truth shining through the room. His mistake had not merely been underestimating a boy, but exposing the fragility of his own arrogance. Caleb, however, didn't smile, didn't thank him, didn't seek glory. He simply held his gaze steady, as if to say without words that he didn't need applause to confirm what was already clear. This moment wasn't about vanity, but about justice. And as the quiet applause echoed, there was a sense that something bigger was about to happen, something that would forever change the way everyone viewed not only the boy, but also Victor Langford's empire. Victor tried to clear his throat, as if trying to find his voice after being overwhelmed by an overwhelming silence. He opened his arms in a practiced gesture of confidence, but the words that had once flowed easily now seemed to tangle, too heavy to come out. With each attempt to regain control, his eyes met the cold, piercing gazes of the investors. There was no longer admiration in them, not even neutrality. What remained was silent contempt, the merciless judgment of someone who saw arrogance crumbling before a mere boy. Victor felt his breath catch, sweat dripping down his forehead, and for the first time in years, his erect, proud posture gave way to hesitation. He realized he no longer dominated the room. He was being dominated by an uncomfortable truth that had escaped from his own hands. The foreign guests, accustomed to the brilliance of great tycoons, began to see Victor not as a powerful leader, but as a fragile man, incapable of controlling even his own narrative. The contrast was stark. Caleb, with his simple clothes and almost disconcerting serenity, had earned genuine respect in a matter of minutes, while Victor, owner of mansions, yachts, and businesses, was losing everything that truly matters in a business meeting: his credibility. Some investors whispered among themselves, others shook their heads in disapproval, and there were even those who silently stared at Angela with unexpected recognition, as if symbolically restoring the dignity stolen by so many humiliations. Victor felt it like invisible stabs, each look heavier than any words, and he understood that his image would never be the same. Still, he tried to react. He forced a bitter laugh, clapped his hands as if to pretend it was all just a big joke, but no one joined in. The dry sound of his own clapping echoed lonely, a cruel reminder that he was alone in his pathetic attempt to appear in control. He stared at Caleb, expecting to see him flinch under the pressure, but found only firmness and calm. It was in that instant that Victor understood, with an almost physical shock, that he had lost the most important thing of all: respect. What had once been laughter and mockery had now turned to silence and revulsion. And this silence, more deafening than any applause, set the stage for the final blow, a moment that would make his humiliation even more evident and inescapable for all to see. Angela clutched her yellow gloves tightly, trying to contain the whirlwind of emotions coursing through her. For years, he had endured Victor's arrogant looks, cutting words, and humiliations disguised as jokes. Now, before dozens of illustrious witnesses, he saw the son he had so often helped with his studies at night, under the dim light of the kitchen, shine among an elite group that would never recognize him as an equal. Tears stung her eyes, but they weren't of pain, but of pride. Every sacrifice, every late night spent in silence so as not to wake Caleb while he studied, every dish washed, every floor polished, everything made sense in that moment. A mother's heart beat louder than any suppressed applause echoing through the luxurious ballroom. Caleb, for his part, wasn't seeking recognition. He stood erect, with the same serene expression he'd maintained throughout the episode, as if he knew deep down that his dignity was the only asset that truly mattered. The once invisible boy had, in a matter of minutes, proven that wisdom isn't a privilege of the rich, but the fruit of discipline, curiosity, and courage. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't demand attention, he didn't challenge anyone directly. He simply demonstrated, with the clarity of his words, that a person's true worth lies far beyond the labels on their clothes or the grandeur of their surname. And in doing so, he silently shattered the wall of arrogance that had held Victor back in front of his guests. Victor, in the end, found no words. The man who had used his voice as an instrument of power and intimidation now remained silent, his lips dry and his gaze lost. He tried to find an honorable exit, but no mask could hide what everyone saw. A millionaire reduced to his own smallness before a 14-year-old boy. The entire room had shifted its axis. Respect no longer revolved around his figure, but around the son of the maid he swore was worthless. Angela took her son's arm, as if introducing him to the world, and the room felt lighter, more equitable. And so, as Victor lowered his eyes, unable to react, Caleb stepped out of the shadows, leaving behind his invisibility to become an example of dignity. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any moving stories. And, of course, leave a like, because that really helps the channel continue to bring inspiring stories like this one. Thank you so much for your support.